Castlevania Advance Collection. Today I want to talk a little bit about each of the games in this collection. There are only 4 games in this particular collection. However, as a whole, it is still one of the stronger collections that you can buy, as it does feature 3 of the best Game Boy Advance games that were ever released. However, we're going to do this in chronological order. So sadly, first we have to talk about the weakest game in the collection by far. Castlevania Dracula X, originally released for the Super Nintendo. This game here was a sort of remake of Castlevania Rondo of Blood, only not good. A lot of the design choices made for Dracula X harken back to the 8-bit days. Your whip only attacks in front of you. There is no attacking or jumping on the stairs. Enemy placement designed purely to frustrate? You betcha. I truly don't understand why this, of all games, was included in this collection. But I guess you have the other 3 games here to compensate for this game's overall terribleness. Well, I'm glad that's over with. Now we can talk about 3 games that are actually good. Starting with a Game Boy Advance launch title, Castlevania Circle of the Moon. You will notice right off the bat that this game has very different graphics from any other game in the Castlevania franchise. Also, this game was very, very dark to play on the original Game Boy Advance. But playing it nowadays on a TV, or even on the Switch, that is no longer a problem. However, while these graphics looked pretty good for a launch title on the GBA, they do look a little odd when blown up onto a TV nowadays. Still, this was a fairly large Metroidvania for the time, with many secrets to find and power-ups to get. It also had that unique card system that's never been repeated, and at least in this collection, it's a lot easier to find all those cards so you can actually see the full potential of that card system. I think this could have been improved by having a merchant of some kind. Then you wouldn't have to spend hours trying to farm potions for hard boss fights, and perhaps the merchant could have sold some of the more utilitarian cards for things like getting the Ice Whip. Then again, having something like that may have made this game just a little too easy. Still, it's a great game to go back and play, and really showed off the potential of the handheld it was launched with. Moving on. A year after Circle of the Moon, we got Castlevania Harmony of Dissonance. And you can tell they realized that Circle of the Moon was a little too dark for the hardware. So now our protagonist looks like a circus ringmaster with a blue outline around him at all times. Our protagonist also has a lot more mobility this time around, as your L and R buttons make him dash around. Now the main gimmick of this game is that there's not 1, but 2 castles here, and they're overlaid on top of each other. Sort of like a dark and light world mechanic, but the differences aren't apparent enough that on your first playthrough you'll fully understand what's going on. At least not till you get towards the end of the adventure. The cards from the last game are gone. In their place you find various tomes. These tomes affect how your sub-weapons work. The first one you're likely to find is the Ice Tome, and you can combine it with some of the most useless of the sub-weapons, and get some truly magnificent effects. Admittedly, this system pretty much ensures you're never going to use the vanilla sub-weapons in this game, but as good as many of the combinations are, I don't miss them. Also, they brought back a merchant. Also, they added this little collecting aspect to the game, where you find furniture. And there's a little room you can go to where apparently your character has taken time away from his busy Dracula hunting job to decorate a room just for himself in Dracula's castle. I'm pretty sure that's not an effective use of his time, but then again, hunting vampires is probably a pretty stressful job, and we all need some kind of release. This game also includes a twist that you see coming from like the very earliest parts of it. This was clearly trying to find a hook for the Metroidvania style of Castlevania, starting to bring back a lot more of the elements from Symphony of the Night, with slight modifications. And while it did do a great job of what it set out to do, This game does often get overshadowed by the game previous to it, and of course the game that came right after it, which is of course Castlevania Aria of Sorrow. And this game decided to do a whole bunch of different things. First off, it has a modern setting, which does allow you to see how modern weapons would fare in Dracula's castle, like a handgun. It also brings back characters from other games, though it's not upfront with who these characters actually are, at least not at first. And also, you're not playing as a Belmont. You're playing as someone that just might be the reincarnation of Dracula. Or at the very least, a part of Dracula. The part of Dracula that has dominion over other creatures and their abilities. You spend a lot of this game killing and re-killing enemies to absorb their powers so you can use them against other enemies. And this idea was liked so much that it showed up in other Castlevania games, and in games that weren't Castlevania, at least technically speaking. As after all, the want to complete the collection will drag out the playtime of this game if you're so inclined. And your enemy abilities was actually woven into puzzles of this game, where you need to use a specific combination of abilities to access certain areas and secrets. It can get a little annoying when you're backtracking through this game, as you'll have to swap around your abilities frequently to deal with specific obstacles inside Dracula's castle. Especially when there's two different abilities for kind of the same issue. Like, you have one ability to walk underwater without floating, but then you have a second ability to just walk on top of the water. These could have just been combined into one ability. This game also allowed you to change your weapon, so you weren't stuck with just a whip like the previous two games. And what weapons you use will depend a lot on how you play the game. Do you go for a slow weapon with a ton of power? Or do you go for a fast weapon that's kinda weak? Something in between? Or something that has a bit longer range on it? And not all situations are going to be equally valid for all weapons. So your weapon ends up being kind of like another ability slot, so you're going to be seeing the menu a lot in this particular game. But the sheer amount of control and customization you have does make this game incredibly enjoyable to play, as you don't know what abilities you're actually going to find without doing a ton of grinding. So if you do a playthrough where you limit yourselves to just abilities you get organically, it can make the game experience wildly different between playthroughs, which I think is part of the reason this sort of became the default for what a lot of Metroidvanias were going forward. While the Castlevania Advance Collection might be short in terms of game list, it's pretty high up there in terms of quality. Combining 3 amazing Metroidvanias into one package does give this collection a lot of playtime. Sadly, it also forces you to have a copy of Dracula X, which honestly probably should have just been in the regular Castlevania collection. Its inclusion in this collection truly baffles me, and I feel like another Metroidvania should have been put in its place. You know, Symphony of the Night comes immediately to mind. A game not available on Switch or PC as of this recording. But we're not here to talk about that. We were just here to talk about every game in a particular collection. And there will be more videos like this where we discuss every game in a particular collection. I started with the Castlevania Advance Collection specifically because of how few games were here. I was originally going to do the Genesis Collection, but there's over 50 games there, and that's going to take a little more time to cook. Please do subscribe, comment, like, and tell your friends.